Lots of familiar faces in the audience, so thank you all for coming, and thank you for coming early and making this session. This is we've got an hour to go over, I guess, a lot, and so I'm going to make just a few framing comments in the beginning, and then I'm going to ask each of the participants just to go down, I guess, in the order that they're sitting, to pick up on some of those framing issues from their own perspectives. And then we'll get into a bit of a discussion around a few points that we've articulated and we've identified. And then hopefully we'll have enough time for questions from the audience. So if, as we speak, some things occur to you, please do make note of it, and we can ask questions, I guess, towards the end. So the timing for this couldn't have been more appropriate if Samir was in charge of the roster at the Supreme Court, because at this point in time we're sitting exactly a week away from the decision of the Supreme Court in the Aadhaar case. But just going back a little bit, earlier this year, GDPR came into force. GDPR, as we all know, is probably the most modern data protection legislation in the world. It's the blueprint that a lot of countries are looking to follow. And from the output of the Justice Sri Krishna Committee report, it looks like India is leaning in the direction of adopting a GDPR-style law. But even within that, the Indian Personal Data Protection Bill, while it does capture a lot, the GDPR has some significant differences. And if we are, as a nation, going to adopt that framework, the framework that's been set out in the draft Personal Data Protection Bill, what are the implications to all of us? And given that the Supreme Court has now ruled on the Aadhaar case, I think it's important to recognize, apart from what exactly the Supreme Court said in that case, this is the first instance after the 9-judge Puttaswamy decision when the Supreme Court actually applied the various tests and reasonings and rationale that was laid down in the Puttaswamy judgment at a theoretical level. This is the first time that they applied it in practice. And so from the perspective of privacy professionals who are examining implications in this space, it is an extremely important judgment in that it actually tells us how the court will be thinking about a lot of these theoretical issues. I think that's the broad framework within which we wanted to base this discussion. There are a number of issues that I would like to go into. These may or may not focus specifically on the provisions of either the GDPR or the Personal Data Protection Bill, but I think these are discussions that are important to have. And so I would like to ask each of the participants on the panel today to very briefly, one, introduce themselves, and in particular, the particular constituency that they represent, their experiences, which will frame the comments that they put up, and in a few words, I guess, just talk about this framing that I have done and what their perspectives are. So, Megha, could we start with you?
Hi everyone. First, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Samir and the ORF team. I think they've set up a wonderful platform for some thought-provoking conversation, and it's an absolute honor to be here. At this point, I'd also like to put out a disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer, and anything I'll be discussing will not be legal advice, and they're my own personal views and not that of my employer, which is Palantir Technologies. I work as a data scientist with the privacy team at Palantir, and some things which Rahul mentioned in the opening note is that there's GDPR, and we have the Indian Data Protection Bill, and we are thinking of what it has exported from GDPR, as is, what are the important departures from GDPR, and what is it that leads us closer to ideal data protection. And I would like to elaborate on that a little bit, I think, to get us started. So when I think about aspects of GDPR which we should incorporate as is in any data protection regulation, I think there are some great guiding principles which GDPR provides. If there's a GDPR compliant workflow, then, and when I say workflow, in my head it's always a data science workflow. That's how I'm wired to think, I guess. But if you have a GDPR compliant data science workflow, it means that it's almost certain that you have taken out the time to think about transparency and accessibility, fair information, practice principles of access, control, notice. You've thought about privacy by design. There are features which are multiple levels deep here. There are things like identity awareness, data provenance, granular access control, data retention, data deletion, and I think these are features from GDPR which should be core to any platform or even workflow which deals with user data or private data of any form, and this provides a great start for any such problem. But at the same time, we have business motivation now with what EU has done, given that there are a lot of other companies which are dealing with data related to EU citizens. There is business motivation to why all these workflows should be GDPR compliant. But I think that it will be a missed opportunity if that is where we stop. We need to go the extra mile from there. And why I say that is, one, GDPR is not going to be always relevant or even always applicable, especially in context of emerging markets. When I think about problems, even in India to start with, last CyFy, accessibility was a big aspect, a big problem that was discussed. I don't think that is something which EU or the US has necessarily confronted with. So if we try to use these aspects of GDPR as is, there'll be failure. So we have room to do more because of this relevance concern. And I also believe, just like every other thing out there, GDPR is not perfect. And it is very apparent when we start asking questions like how generalizable it is. Is it too general? What do GDPR workflows look like in different sectors? How is it being enforced in different regions? And that is when we see that it's not a perfect privacy doctrine, and that is what sets the pretext for why we need to take that extra step. When I think about the ideal data regulation, there has to be individual dignity and fundamental rights of privacy at the very top. But the other two edges of this triangular problem is obviously national and state security, which I think China has paid a lot of attention to. And then to add to it, it's business motivation, that trade still has to function. Businesses still should be able to operate, and regulation should not throttle that. And I think as we think about GDPR and what we need to take from GDPR, what is it that we need to do extra on top of GDPR to take this game a notch up, that is what will make us move closer to better data protection.
Thanks, Megha. Peter, do you want to pick up on that triangle of individual, state, and business?
Yeah, I love that visual, and thanks. Yeah, I think that was a great place to start talking about those fundamental principles and bringing it back to the core interests at stake here. My organization, I can speak a little bit about our work and who we represent, as you asked, and then talk about more specifically where we're at in the data protection bill that's in work here. So my name is Peter Mysek. I'm with Access Now. We are a global digital rights organization. We run a digital security helpline. That's a 24/7 service that operates in about 10 languages that gives a human response to users at risk within a couple of hours. People come to us with all sorts of questions. About 60% are after something has gone wrong, after they've lost control of their social media accounts, their devices, their websites, or they're being attacked or abused for who they are or what they do. And so these at-risk users come to us, and a lot of the questions that they ask us have to do with how they can get in touch with their preferred social media channel or service, those services where they've invested their time and expertise and resources to build an audience, to get their message out, whether they're an environmental defender talking about a new dam that's being constructed, whether they're from a sexual or gender minority group talking about the need for equal rights in their country, or whether they're a feminist organization advocating for women under the SDGs. It's really the wide range of folks, many of whom are in this room, who need more information, need more power and control over how their personal data is collected, processed, and used online. And they come to us in times of need. About 60% of the cases are after something has gone wrong. And a lot of what we do is put them in touch with the platforms, with the private companies. People don't understand who to call out and try to reach when they're facing problems online. And so that's the service that we try to provide. But rather than doing it piecemeal one by one, we do try to look for the lessons learned. And so that's what we've done over the last 6 years with our Brussels office, is try to bring those lessons from the front line and take them to policymakers, focusing on the development of the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU. We're really happy, we are happy with the result of the Brussels lawmaking effort. Not perfect, as you said, Megha, absolutely. And of course, the devil is in, I would say, the enforcement details. We don't know how this law is going to be implemented, whether it will be consistent and strong across 28 member states of the EU, much less the rest of the world, where it's also being reflected and reverberating. And so that's something we have to see. But from our perspective, it's absolutely appropriate that that Delhi looks at the lessons learned from the GDPR. And reflects on those and tries to build and strengthen the protections for users in India informed by the GDPR. So to that end, we've actually put out a booklet. It's on our website, accessnow.org, and it's got the 15 lessons that we've learned from our work in Brussels over the past however long it took to pass that law, and 15 points from open and clear, transparent consultation processes all the way down to enforcement, implementation, and remedy. And we've actually assessed the proposed bill in India against these 15 points and found that there's a lot of room for improvement. A few things that it gets right, I can say, the start of privacy by design, as you said, support for strong encryption, one of the first times we've seen that in law here, I believe. And the scope of the law is adequate. It's absolutely strong on saying that both public and private entities need process data, impact our fundamental human right to privacy and data protection, and therefore should fall within the scope of the law. And it's not self-regulatory. It's not giving a pass to companies, and we really think that's strong. Areas, though, for improvement. Absolutely on surveillance and government processing. I would throw the localization requirement into this general weakness of the proposed bill on holding government accountable for its collection and processing of personal data. There's vague language like the exercise of state functions as a reason to process data in this bill beyond consent of users, and given the Indian government's union government's clear interest in collecting and processing a whole lot of data, we think that the government is going to be a major stakeholder in data processing in this country, and therefore needs to be very clearly held accountable to this law. So I can leave it there, but again, really appreciate being here, and I'm happy to participate.
Great. Aaron, something from your side on the I guess we can get into the details, but opening remarks around these issues?
Sure. Thank you. So my name is Aaron Cooper. I run the global policy program at an association called BSA, the Software Alliance. We represent primarily enterprise software companies, companies like Microsoft, IBM, Salesforce, Symantec, Adobe, Apple, companies like that that are providing services primarily to other enterprise and other companies. So it's a business-to-business type transaction. We are based in Washington, D.C., but we do work in more than 60 countries around the world. And privacy and security issues are a top priority for our industry, because to provide the cloud services, the data analytics, the development of AI that our companies do, it's crucial to have the right data security laws in place. And we are seeing an increasing amount of activity around the world on privacy and data security legislation. So India is considering it right now. We're also seeing developments in Thailand and Singapore. And Japan just went through a process. Korea. The United States is actually seriously considering federal privacy legislation for the first time in a while. So as we look at this, I wanted to sort of raise three key aspects that we think about in considering how to approach new privacy and data security legislation. A first key aspect is making sure that there's interoperability and consistency among privacy systems. A second is making sure that we are meeting the privacy and security demands of our customers. And the third is making sure that we think about what the impact of privacy and data security laws will be on jobs in the economy, not just in the tech sector, but how it reverberates throughout the economy. So let me just take each of those three really quickly. On interoperability and consistency, when we say interoperability, we are usually thinking about the importance of making sure that data protection systems allow data to flow from one country to another, because the level of protection in each country is relatively similar, and the entity that is transferring the data will be accountable to make sure that the data is processed in a way consistent with the home country's law. But there's another aspect to it that's important, which is making sure that the rights and obligations that are part of a data security law are consistent in different geographic regions. That doesn't mean that we need to take the GDPR or another privacy data protection law and cut and paste it into every country's law. I don't think that would be appropriate, and I think that there are important differences that reflect the privacy and security needs and interests of the local jurisdiction. But it's important that we have consistency across markets, so that we don't have a situation where a company is going to be acting in one way in one market and a different way in a different market, and confusing consumers as a result, it will lead to confusion among consumers about how their data is going to be protected, and as a practical matter, impossible to provide services across borders at a top level in the most efficient way. Second aspect of this second key point that I wanted to make was on privacy and security demands of our customers. As an industry, if we aren't meeting those demands, we're not going to get business. So as a practical matter, it is really important that the customer expectations be met. And I think one of the things to look for in the consumer rights that are in the GDPR, that are in the draft Indian Protection Bill, and that we talk about in various different jurisdictions around the world, is making sure that those match up to what customers actually want. Sometimes there's a risk of having provisions in legislation that look like they would be privacy protective, but as a practical matter aren't meeting customer expectation. So that's the second aspect that I think is very important. And the third is making sure that the data protection systems that we put in place are good for the economy and job creation in every industry sector. So often conversations around privacy and data security are about the tech industry and large platforms in particular, and their relation with consumers that are using those social media or other platforms. But for the types of companies that BSA represents, that are primarily business-to-business type software companies, we're providing those services to industries across the board, agriculture, manufacturing, retail. And data protection and security laws will have a huge impact on them as well. We are at the forefront of making sure our compliance systems are up to speed, but I think that one of the experiences from Europe and the GDPR going into place is that it took a while for businesses in other industry sectors to realize that they are all data economy participants, and those privacy and security laws affect them as well. So those are the three key aspects that I wanted to highlight, and is important that I hope that we will think about going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Kasia?
Hello, good morning. My name is Kasia Odrozek, and let me just thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be part of this discussion. I represent here the Mozilla Foundation. It's a nonprofit behind the privacy-conscious browser Firefox, but we also do much more than that. We are trying to build a movement for so-called healthy internet, trying to make the internet free and accessible for all. And I particularly work on an annual publication called the Internet Health Report. It's a report made in a kind of open source way where we're trying to measure how healthy the internet is, meaning how much is it a force for good or not, and what that actually means. And one of the questions asked yesterday at the panel made me think about our work as well. The question was about how would you define a public good in a cyberspace? And for the Internet Health Report in general at Mozilla, we're working with a framework of so-called 5 issues, where we with these 5 issues, we're trying to define what a healthy internet might be. When is it a force for good? And we ask questions like, how open is it? If people can innovate and build on the achievements of the internet, one of the founding principles of the internet. Who is welcome online? So this touches upon the digital inclusion issues. We ask who can succeed online. This is about web literacy, not only being a passive consumer of the internet, but also being able and have the skills to co-shape it. We also ask who controls it, and this touches upon the issues of decentralization and centralization, issues that we are very familiar with. And finally, we also ask how safe is it? Because we believe that in order to feel and be ourselves online, we need to be able to trust the systems that protect us. And one of the founding principles of Mozilla is security and privacy. We think these issues, these values are essential, and they are not ever to be treated as optional. And of course, we know data enables innovation. It brings about fantastic new enhancements to our lives, like voice recognition or machine learning. But it also has a potential to harm if our personal details, romantic, financial data is being leaked. It's just like the saying with the knife, you can be used to cut a fruit or to kill someone. So we can bring up arguments for both of the camps, but what we really should start talking about is a so-called responsible tech and what that means. It's estimated by 2020 we're gonna have around 30 billion connected devices online. And so the challenges will grow. We're moving we're moving from the desktop to the world of mobile and to the world of IoT. And with listening machines at homes, with satellites being able to recognize the cars from outer space. And we need to start thinking about steps forward and how to tackle this issue, how to empower users and to give them back control over their digital footprint, if that's possible at all. And I think the GDPR is exactly a step in the right direction, even if it's not perfect, as my co-panelists already pointed out, as it defines strict rules for companies around privacy, data processing, and consent. And then basically it's raising the bar worldwide of what we demand from data controllers. At Mozilla, we conducted a survey some time ago of around 30,000 people across different geographies, and we asked them what they scared about. And the results showed us that 8 out of 10 people fear being hacked. 61% are concerned about being tracked by an advertiser, and 91% don't know how to protect themselves online. So I think this survey also shows that the main issue that we face now is the trust issue, and that creates a negative dynamic both on the user side but also on the company side. So both of the parties cannot make the best out of of their online presence in that. So I think that also with a framework like GDPR, it also creates a chance for the companies to think about privacy in a new way, as a competitive advantage. It brings about a shift in the mindset. And not only because this will be the growing demand from users, which I'm convinced of, but also because this will enable them to unlock new markets for business. Once you have privacy protection and the same high quality standards, you can enter markets who demand this kind of standards, and you can welcome also businesses from these markets to your market. So I think GDPR has a substantial potential to be a standard setting regulation, and frankly with the internet's borderless nature, it's already happening, because not many countries or companies really can afford to shut down a market of 500 million people, and several countries are already following up with GDPR Lite and regulations modeled after the European Union's regulation. And another argument is that I think the economies of scale will tell us that companies prefer actually a global compliance regime. It's very costly to, just as was pointed out already, to start developing products for different data protection regimes on a long scale. So if India or if European Union have this kind of strong privacy protection of block, this is what is going to be more practical also for the companies. Of course, we need to be aware of the cost of such compliance for small and medium enterprises. But that shouldn't be an excuse for lowering privacy standard ambitions. The ecosystem has to come together, not only the regulators, but also the business itself, to make sure that everybody has the chance and the possibility to be compliant. At the same time, at the core of the challenge is that the regulations need to be implementable. And I think we're still learning about the effects of GDPR in Europe. It's a bit maybe still early to make a full impact assessment. They should fulfill the purpose and not impose unhelpful burdens of companies. That's clear. And ensuring that the regulation is relevant to region, context, and language, this is crucial, but it might be confusing for companies that operate across different jurisdictions. We need to strive for consistency, and maybe a good first step would be to come up with a set of shared principles to create this kind of baseline that I think we really desperately need in these times, because it's been said already, acknowledged that privacy is a human right. So also in the cyberspace, we need to start treating it as such, not as a privilege, but as an obligation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kasia. And Lenard, just to round this up, if there is a point that hasn't been said yet in this very rich panel, could you?
Right. Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. My name is Lenard, and I work with organization called Allied for Startups, and Allied for Startups is a global network of national, regional startup communities, and our mission is to empower these communities to make their way in interacting with governments and policy makers. So if you imagine as government as being a rather complex and mid to long term and highly technical process, we love our startups because they're so agile, small, often young, but not always, young teams that innovate in an iterative manner and change and adapt and use the newest technologies to get the consumers closer together and to improve our lives and societies. You can see there's a little bit of a gap, and we love our entrepreneurs for not spending time in government. So we are here to bridge that gap a little bit and to empower local and national startup communities to understand and navigate government and decision making, also anticipate that so they can have educated conversations with their investors and show that they understand the regulatory framework that they're in. And we believe that this is good for startup entrepreneurs, because startup entrepreneurs at the base, they obviously want to be compliant. I cannot agree more with what Kasia said. There is being a small company should never be an excuse to protect individual or human rights any less. I think the big challenge for policymakers is to find a way to get there. On the other hand, we also think there is a good deal for governments and decision makers to have that conversation with startup communities and entrepreneurs, because it can really validate and empower their policies at the end of the day. We've heard a lot the notion of the importance of implementation of policies as measure of their success. And we'd like to make sure that startup entrepreneurs are just as able to implement new policies as large companies are. So if you want, we're bridging a little bit of a gap there between the startup world, but also the government world. And one of the big topics we've been working on over the years has been data protection and the GDPR. And I think one of the aspects that I also wanted to underline from the GDPR perspective, that this is on the one hand obviously a piece to protect individuals' data, but on the other hand, once we are clear about these principles that have been mentioned of protecting data, we have a comfort of letting data flow freely. And this is a very important aspect that I'm not sure has been mentioned enough. And the free flow of data is really something that comes very naturally to startup entrepreneurs. A McKinsey study said, and our work confirms, that startups are really born global. There is no ambition in building a flourishing local startup, but the aim is always to go across borders, to sell and be successful globally. And this is the huge benefit that we have through economies of scale. And the free flow of data, or on the other hand, no data borders or no unjustified data localization measures, it's really something that comes naturally to these entrepreneurs. And if data localization measures exist, then this is something that also hits the smallest companies first, because they have to multiply the cost and the complexity that goes into the cloud system, and we deprive them of the ability of choosing really the best and the most secure cloud architecture for their businesses. And this is true for both Indian entrepreneurs that want to go global, as well as for global or non-Indian entrepreneurs that are interested and attracted in scaling in the Indian market. I think this is a very, very important aspect for us to mention. Interoperability and consistency has been mentioned earlier, and we really want to strive to have a global consensus here on policies that matter for startup entrepreneurs. But it is absolutely crucial that we think of the complexity that these laws bring with us. So let's think for a moment of the aim and the goal of what we want to achieve with these policies, and then the means and the instruments that we choose to get there. Speaking for startup entrepreneurs, it is really, really crucial that we keep legal clarity across borders, but also a certain simplicity and, just clarity in mind that enables new market entrants and startups to comply just as well as those that have armies of lawyers and always find a way of navigating such legal complexity. There is a clear relation between the economies of scale and the advantages we can gain from that, and the amount of kind of individual contracts and agreements a company has to conclude. So let's not stifle this power of scale that technology has brought us in democratizing entrepreneurship. A wealth of online platforms that help entrepreneurs today to launch their idea, to realize their idea, and to give it a try on the market without much more than maybe a few $100s and a computer, by adding too much of legal complexity. This is really something that is dear to our heart, and I want to stop here, leave enough room for an exchange and a conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lenard. And I think just going through, I made sort of quick notes going through the opening remarks of the panel, and I think what comes out is actually one of the fundamental challenges with, I guess, any policy, but particularly in the tech space with data protection policy, which is this challenge of balancing. And I think, as Megha put it right in the beginning, there's that triangle of individual interest, state interest, and business interest. There's the challenge of interoperability between nation states, the need to ensure that companies actually are not put to undue difficulty because of a changing landscape in every jurisdiction that they operate in. And I thought we'd just spend the next 15, 20 minutes discussing a few points around that. One of the first points I wanted to talk about, I mean, everyone's spoken about in some detail, I think, GDPR, but to bring it down to India, where we actually need to, in Peter's words, learn the lessons of GDPR in our Indian context. One of the issues, and Lenard, I'll just go straight back to you on localization. One of the hot issues in the current context is the issue of data localization. The Indian government, through a series of regulatory pronouncements, starting with an RBI circular on payments data, has incrementally introduced this concept of localization in the Indian context. We've seen it reflected in the Personal Data Protection Bill, and then in the draft e-commerce policy, which was quickly withdrawn. There was another reference to localization. I think the concerns were well articulated, Lenard, from the perspective of a startup. But I think it's worth getting into some detail as to, I think the balance in localization is not so much the startup concern as the government wanting law enforcement access to personal data that is potentially held outside of the country that they struggle to get access to. And I think we will never solve this problem unless we recognize that there are two sides to this coin, and that we've got to find some way to balance that. I think, I know startups should be able to set up in the cloud, but at the same time, they shouldn't use the cloud to prevent legitimate data access for legitimate law enforcement needs. And it might be worthwhile for the panel to spend a few minutes just talking about that. I'd start with you, Lenard, but if anyone has, just put your hand up and I'll catch my attention and I'll point to you.
Right, yeah, thank you very much. So I think it is perhaps worthwhile mentioning as well that the concept the European Union applies to data localization, or to the free flow of data, if we want to frame it in a more positive way, is that it is that there's still a possibility for the individual states, the governments, to have justified reasons that allow them to store some of their data locally. So this is by no means infringing or intervening too far into the sovereignty of states. But what it does, on the other hand, it gives very clear legal certainty for companies and users to find really the most secure cloud provider and the most adequate and best cloud architecture for their users to provide really an added value. One of the vice president of the European Commission made a quite strong reference to the security aspect, where he says storing data locally for the reasons of security is like hiding your money inside a sock under your pillow to keep it safe. And I think this is really something that we have to reflect upon and keep in mind, that the physical location of data does not say a lot about the actual security of how this data is stored. And we would not object to any conversation that gives a clear and including judicial oversight framework to law enforcement access. But this shouldn't come through something as far-reaching as data localization.
Sure, but I think what law enforcement, particularly in India, and Aaron, I'll turn to you, because I'm sure a lot of your the companies that are part of the BSA have to deal with requests from local law enforcement for personal data. I think the law enforcement in India particularly feels that U.S. companies, and I'm sorry to target the U.S., but very often the requests are made to U.S. companies, stonewall the legitimate law enforcement requests by saying, the data is not in India, the data is somewhere else in the US, so file an MLAT request, and then the MLAT request takes 22 months to resolve. That really, it's less a security concern, it's more a how do we actually deal with this? And on the other hand, I think sometimes the Indian government can be unreasonable and ask for data that perhaps shouldn't be disclosed. There is a balance in this, and how do the companies that form part of the BSA deal with these sorts of things in a, if I may say so, constructive manner, such that we can move this discussion on?
Well, let me say first, I think you mentioned security as part of that, and I think Lenard did a really good job of explaining why, from a data security, a cybersecurity perspective, having a data localization law doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think that's also partly why we see the push around the world. The global trend has been towards preventing or prohibiting data localization requirements. You see it in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You see it in North America in the revised NAFTA agreement. The general consensus has been that data localization laws are not good, and largely because of the cybersecurity implication. Lenard also touched on how data localization and data flows often go together. The ability to transfer data, regardless of whether there's also a requirement for a local copy to be stored, is extremely as important as we talk about data analytics and development of AI, because having the best data sets in order to train systems, in order to provide unbiased and positive results, requires the ability to transfer data around the world. I think what's key for law enforcement access issues and for other privacy-related concerns when data gets transferred is accountability on behalf of the party that is transferring the data, the controller of the data. And I think that, more than the location of where the data is stored, is key.
Right. So let me just pick up on that point and move to the only data scientist on the panel. Megha, I guess the challenge with a lot of these regulations is that they are constantly trying to catch up with technology. And I think Kasia mentioned this briefly. We're in a world where machines are collecting data from us without us really knowing and understanding it. And a lot of that data is being harvested using machine learning algorithms, artificial intelligence, which then come up with some almost magical results in terms of what they can do in a variety of fields. Facial recognition essentially grew out of the ability that Google had to train its AI on vast amounts of Google photos that we uploaded just for safekeeping, but was fabulous training data for the algorithm to really improve on facial recognition technologies. And I want you to spend a little time on just that balance between, on the one hand, we need to allow these machine learning algorithms free rein over data in order to train themselves to potentially give better results. But in doing that, we are in some ways actually violating our own principles around privacy and what purpose the data can be used for. So some of these regulations on purpose limitation, use limitation, data minimization run contrary to some of the principles on which machine learning and AI currently function. And how do we address that balance so that we can actually make the most of the new technologies, but at the same time not violate privacy?
Right. I think, Rahul, it is the need of the hour to think about how we can augment these models to introduce privacy controls, which I understand is a very hard task, because as soon as we talk about machine learning and AI, it is black box. It's black box algorithms, and how do you augment something which you do not even fully understand? But I think the good thing there is that it has led to this entirely new field of work, which falls under the category of FAT-ML, which is fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning. There's a lot of work under the category of explainable AI. And what this essentially means is that it is not just okay to have a label at the very end, just a category where you send complicated data, the more sophisticated algorithm, so you don't understand the data because it's complex. You don't understand the algorithm because it is even more sophisticated, and you just come up with the label. What is important is, this is what actually right to explanation also triggered, that you need to explain how you reach to that prediction. There are hundreds of people in Google, Facebook, Microsoft who work on this new topic called fairness in ML and AI. And there's some very interesting work. There is work by Professor Arvind from Princeton where he comes up with 21 different definitions of fairness. And what that basically means is that what is even fairness? Do we mean fairness in treatment, or fairness in result, or in the inference process? There's a line of work which deals with surfacing bias. So what we are trying to do is that instead of enabling these models to make prediction, introduce a human being in the loop. And what that would do is that instead of getting decisions, what these algorithms should do is that they should inform decision making. I see that personally as an opportunity, and I think these regulations only kind of make these tech giants to think about these problems more actively, make smart people work on these problems, and come up with these very interesting solutions.
So, I think FAT-ML is really interesting as a conceptual framework, and of course, the concept of fairness and accountability is reflected in GDPR in some sense, in that there needs to be an explanation for machine-driven decisions. That came about because there's a lot of well-documented information of bias that has come up in sentencing programs, in a whole host of programs that were adopted around the world where machine learning predicted some results. But Kasia, I want to just take you to this point in a little more detail, because I think there's a trade-off between accuracy and traceability. I think in certain circumstances, the algorithm will not be as accurate as it could potentially be if you need to take it out of the black box and trace every decision. I think that's completely justifiable when that algorithm is going to sentence someone to life imprisonment. But is it so justifiable when that algorithm could potentially save someone's life, in that if you apply machine learning to some very complex medical problem like cancer, and it comes up with out of this magic, sometimes it's almost magical the way these things come up with results, and it gives a result that could potentially save someone's life. So in that context, should we completely shut the door on black box algorithms, or is there a place in certain circumstances to allow some machine decisions not to be accountable or not to have to prescribe the logic?
Well, I think it's very attractive to think about this big data exceptionalism in these cases. However, I think we need to remember that we are at the very start of understanding what algorithms are able to do, what they do. We are talking about black box, which stands for we don't know. Of course, on one, it's always easier to remove protections than to put them back in. And I think before we start thinking about deregulating this aspect of data protection, or allowing for less privacy, for maybe what we would consider a bigger good in this aspect, we need to first understand what the threats are and understand the whole issue and also the technical aspect of it a little bit better. Because of course, on one side, when we would use the personal data, sensitive data, that should not be allowed at all. As you mentioned, just data that would be used to decide on who's going to jail and why, or who's going to interview which business, and so on. But at the same time, I think using it for this kind of purposes of curing cancer, I think we still have to wait and find out more about the industry. And also it makes me think about whether for example, in medical professions, we should be able to actually understand what we're doing and why, and not blindly trust the machines. So I think right now we should more stick to the privacy, traditional privacy principles that we have before throwing. I think that's also the English expression, the baby together out with the bath tube water. So I would say for now let's wait and see, investigate a little bit more what the threats are.
Yes, Aaron.
Can I say one thing on that? I think yesterday Dr. Rai gave a good way of thinking about legislation in this area, and he was talking about a graph with innovation and security and how you have to try to balance those. And of course, that's a shorthand for a lot of different factors that you have to think about that way. But I think when we think about regulation, we're always either regulating in order to prevent bad outcomes, in which case we know we're also limiting the ability to do good things, or we are regulating in order to enable as many good things as possible, knowing that there will be bad actors that will then take advantage of the way it's drafted. I think that's an important thing as we think about new technology and we think about how to grapple with explainability of AI, for instance. It's an important thing to keep in mind. I think that the example of FATML, the accountability, transparency, fairness, is one of many examples where you see industry and academics taking a lead in making sure that they are acting responsibly. Because at the end of the day, at least for the companies that I represent, they're entering into big money contracts with their customers, and their customers want to know how their systems work. So there's a need from a customer basis to be able to explain how your system operates.
So I'm going to throw it open to the audience. So if you've got your questions, just put your hand up. But before that, I just wanted to ask Peter one question. Just since you've done all this work and you've got 15 points on that the Sri Krishna committee can learn on this. Clearly, there are some significant differences as well. You pointed to some of the good things that we've done, but there are others, and I just wanted to pick on a couple. Just grounds of processing. GDPR is quite sophisticated in additional grounds other than consent. And I think in India we've done away with contract, and our legitimate use or reasonable purpose that we have in the Indian context is a bit strange. It's not exactly the way in which GDPR has it. And if you could just talk on your grounds of processing and just one other point around age verification and children, which is also, I guess, unique in the Indian context, that would be great. And in the meantime, if you can, warm your engines up and put your hands up, we'll just get to you.
Yeah. Thanks again. So first of all, we have put out this new brief about holding up the new proposed data protection bill in India against the lessons learned from the GDPR. My India-based colleague, Raman Jitsing Chima, can answer all of your questions and more about that. He's here. So, I appreciate the question. I think one point that we want to say is that the individual really is at the heart of cybersecurity and data protection, and I think we've seen through the abuses that Cambridge Analytica was able to pull off using a whole bunch of individuals' data in ways that actually do threaten legitimate deep state interests, including in security, shows that actually personal data protection can be the same measures to protect people can also be those measures that protect state security, and that's why we do think it's appropriate to include strong restrictions on including government access to data in this personal data protection bill. On the right of explanation is not something that's in the the Indian bill right now, although, yeah, it is in the GDPR, right to an explanation. And that's why we think the bill needs improvement to be more forward-looking to see how we might want to protect personal data when these new technologies come along. And one of them is to have the machines be able to explain their decisions, and that's important in all sorts of contexts already, including in criminal justice, where machine learning is being used. And then on children, protection of children, well, first of all, children have data protection rights, and they need to be educated in schools on what those rights are and how to protect them. And so this isn't just protecting them from, this is actually empowering children, and UNICEF has done actually a great report recently on children's rights to data and children's rights online that Carly Niss did for them. So, Europe didn't decide. They've had a lot of trouble. 13, 16, what's the right age? I think the point is when you turn 18, you should have a very clear understanding of how to wipe your history if it's not done by default, which it probably should be. And then, in schools, I think educate children as well.
Great. I think there's a gentleman at the mic already. So if you have a question, could you just introduce yourself? And then if it's addressed to anyone in the panel, just point. Others will just do it randomly.
Thank you. My name is Abdul Hakim Ajijola. I'm from Nigeria. Excellent insight and interventions. Thank you very much. On the issue of data localization, maybe Lenard or, well, actually any of the panelists, if you could just educate me a little more, because the sense I've picked up is that you guys generally think it's not a good idea. Now, having said that, I come from a bandwidth-poor environment. And somehow, logically, it doesn't make sense to send these bits whizzing all the way to a server in Chicago and then back through my bandwidth-poor environment. So from an efficiency point of view, would data localization make sense? And then the second challenge that I have in my mind is, if this information is kept on a server in Chicago, for example, that for me implies that the FBI has first bags on my data, rather than my own home police. Now, actually, that may not be a bad idea, because for some of us, getting to a police checkpoint at home might be more scary than getting to a bad guy's checkpoint. But the point still remains that it means that the law enforcement in my country may not have access to my data that it needs, whereas some other foreign law enforcement does. Thank you.
Before either of you answered, I'd just like to pick up one or two more questions. I think there are people in front of each of the mics, so if you could just ask your question briefly, we'll just go through the panel to save time. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, Rahul. Jayanta Fernando from Sri Lanka. Good to see you. Thanks for the excellent panel put in place today. I just had a comment and a question. Can I?
Sure, if you could be brief, because right now we have 3 minutes winding down to 2 very rapidly.
So, first comment relating to your question about MLATs and the request for basic subscriber data and traffic data from foreign service providers. You threw a question to the panel. I'd like to share a perspective from my jurisdiction, Sri Lanka, the island south of India, where we adopted the Budapest Convention approach purely to address that specific issue, which enables a fast track, almost a bypass to the traditional MLAT approach to quickly get the relevant data and information for law enforcement to start finding the basic information to launch an investigation. So that's the first comment. Second is a question in terms of data localization. We see a pattern where big economies and big countries moving towards data localization as a policy approach, but smaller and medium-sized countries can't afford to do that. They have to do business out there, and we have a scenario where countries across the globe are, on the one hand, having a localization approach, and others in a dilemma not being able to take that approach. So what exactly is the policy option that
Got it.
can come?
Got it. And could I just pick up the third question? Yeah.
Hi, good morning. John Mallory from MIT in the U.S. So I have basically, I think, a couple of take-home questions, and I'll just give them to you. So
Could you speak a little into the mic, thanks?
Yeah. So number one is I think we need better analytical models on how we're approaching these laws of GDPR and the Indian and others. And so I'd be interested in your views on how how good the analytical models are that they provide. So, for example, we heard yesterday about some of the macro issues from our Estonian speaker. So imagine you could have an input-output model based on data for your country, so you could do interesting prediction on the economic activity. That would be cool, macro issue. But if you go after local equities too quickly, you'll fragment the situation, so you'll never be able to get those. They may apply in other areas. So next question is, what is the range of equities of concern? I didn't hear too much about corporate equities, a little bit on the market question, but there may be others, so it'd be nice to have a full range of these when thinking about these laws. And then the other one I think of interest is the problem of algorithmic economics. So as you put machine learning and other computational techniques into important functions in society and your economy, any biases or problems in those algorithms will then produce physical manifestations in the systems. So what is the regulatory environment we need to have to be able to detect that those occur, and it may be hard to figure it out in advance, in order to try to be able to minimize any adverse effects? Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. The time's up is flashing vigorously. So I'm going to just perhaps collapse the first two questions because they were both on data localization, and I think the first person put it well. We may trust FBI more than some of our local police, but really that is the fundamental challenge with localization. And I think also the second question, where big economies like India can afford to do things like localization because we perhaps think that we're too big an economy to overlook, but some smaller economies would like to exert the same sort of muscle, but don't have that kind of weight in the global scheme of things. So could any of you very quickly address the first and the second? Lenard's put his hand up first, I think so is Aaron. 1 minute or less.
I do it very, very quickly. So on the efficiency of where the data is stored, companies spend a lot of money trying to figure out what the most efficient way is to both store and process the data in order to get it back to you at the right time. So that might mean having a server down the street. It might mean processing more complicated data somewhere else in the region or back at a home office. But the important thing is letting the companies figure out the most efficient way to do that. In terms of law enforcement access to the data, the location of the data really doesn't have any effect on it. It's perceived that way, like you said, but it doesn't give the FBI any better access to it than wherever it's stored. It's a question of who is storing it and who they're subject to what country they're subject to jurisdiction in. And just to bring in the question from the gentleman from Sri Lanka, I think the global trend really is not that way. I think the global trend is much more towards prohibiting data localization requirements. We do see it in a couple places, some small and some big. China, big. Vietnam, not as big. But most of the world, even Europe, where transferring data out of Europe is more complicated than in a lot of other places, they've taken a strong position against data localization as a mechanism.
Lenard, China and India, if China and India both take localization laws, those are big countries that are going to put localization as its rule. I would say that I am a little concerned about it, and I think we should address it. Lenard, do you have a different question? Because I think Peter also has a point. So very briefly, now it's down to 30 seconds.
Exactly, very briefly, and I want to answer to the gentleman who's, if I understood correctly, from Nigeria. So there's an amazing payment startup in Nigeria called Paystack. And Paystack has attracted a lot of international attention. So I wanted to add another perspective to this. So why would you limit Paystack to only Nigerian cloud providers to compete globally? That was just a third scenario, perhaps, to offer to that. Thank you very much.
Peter, something quickly?
There are environmental reasons as well we should be considering. A lot of countries may not have adequate electricity with the resilience needed, and they shouldn't be producing the types of heat that's generated from large data centers. So, let's not forget the SDGs.
Yeah, I know. And I just wanted to very briefly talk about the equities. Would you want to pick that up, Megha? I mean, I think the economic challenges, both on the plus and negative of algorithms, I think there's significant economic advantages with moving to algorithm-based processing of a lot of these issues. Is that something that we need to consider as perhaps a counterpoint to Kasia's point, which is that we don't know enough about this, but does the economics of it actually outweigh some of that perfect knowledge that regulators always want when they're going after a problem?
I think we need to look at it from a one battle at a time perspective. So the first battle out there is that how do we even identify bias and skew in data? And as I said, there are if we cross that bridge first, then present it through visualization. So surfacing bias is the first battle, and I think we have not done a good job even with that. And then second would be, can we automatically incorporate bias to inform decision making in the machine learning way? And we are very much at the very first step right now. There's been work along these lines, but I don't think, very sadly, I really work in the Silicon Valley, and I don't see a lot of dialogue around this. And I think we have a long way to go. But as I said, one battle at a time.
Well, I guess there's lots we could talk about. The time was limited, and the questions were fabulous and deep, as were a lot of the insights of the panel. Could I just ask you to join me in giving a warm round of applause to the panelists?